The air was thick with humidity, the kind of heaviness that made tempers short and patience thinner than glass. She had arrived at the airport quietly, dressed in a way that drew no attention. Dark slacks, a cream blouse, hair tied back in a low bun, her only accessory a watch that gleamed faintly beneath the terminal lights. To everyone else, she looked ordinary. A middle-aged woman, perhaps. Someone traveling for business or returning from it, no more important than the next 100 travelers dragging their luggage across the tiled floor. Her name was Layla Rahman, though no one said it out loud here. No one recognized her face. The gate agents certainly didn't. Layla stepped forward with a calm grace, as though she were gliding across a world she already owned. She approached the first-class counter, passport in hand. But the attendant barely looked at her before plastering on the kind of smile that was more like a warning than a welcome. "Ma'am, this line is for priority guests only," the attendant said, her tone syrupy but cold beneath the surface. Layla raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think I am?" The woman's eyes skimmed over her plain clothes, her lack of designer luggage, her absence of branded jewelry. All the silent markers that, in this world, screamed wealth. The attendant saw none of it. "I'm afraid you'll have to wait in the general line outside, ma'am. This area is reserved." It was not the words that stung. It was the way they were said, stripped of dignity, like a stranger at her own dinner table being told to eat with the dogs. For the briefest second, Layla considered explaining, clarifying, correcting, but she didn't. She smiled instead, a thin, unreadable curve of her lips. She walked away without protest. Out of the lounge, through the bustling corridor, into the crowded waiting area where people sat slouched in plastic chairs, the smell of sweat and instant noodles lingering. No one knew that she was the founder, the majority shareholder, the silent power behind this airline, an empire she had built out of grit, blood, and unshakable will. No one knew yet. As she sat among the ordinary travelers, she remembered the journey that had brought her here. Memories rose like ghosts. Her father, an engineer who had once dreamed of designing aircraft. The nights she stayed up running numbers when others slept. The deals she fought for in boardrooms where men sneered at her accent, her gender, her skin. She had built everything from nothing, taken the scraps thrown at her and forged them into steel wings that now carried millions across continents. But today, here in this terminal, a gate agent had dismissed her with one sentence. And in that small humiliation, she felt the fire she thought had cooled years ago begin to rise again. Revenge was not her nature, but justice, that she could not ignore. Across the hall, a young mother struggled with 2 children. An elderly man wiped his forehead nervously as he clutched a tattered boarding pass. A student hunched over a laptop, typing as if his future depended on it. These were her passengers too. She thought of them with a pang of responsibility, for she had always said her airline was not built to worship luxury, but to serve humanity. Still, the arrogance of her own staff was eating away at that vision, brick by brick. Her phone buzzed. A single message. It was from her secretary who had secured her seat in silence, knowing she preferred to move unseen when she traveled. "Everything arranged. Flight confirmed. Shall I alert the captain you're on board?" Layla typed back, "No, not yet. Let them see." She put the phone away. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. They thought she was no one. They thought she was just another passenger to be herded, directed, dismissed. That mistake would not be uncorrected. The boarding announcement finally came. The general line shuffled forward like cattle, weary and restless. The same attendant who had told her to wait now scanned tickets with that same brittle smile. When Layla approached, the woman glanced at her boarding pass and blinked. First class. "Oh, I see." Her smile faltered. "Well, you should have—" Layla met her eyes steady and unblinking. "You should have what?" The attendant hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty cracked her composure. But Layla said nothing more. She simply stepped past, her silence louder than any reprimand. Inside the cabin, she settled into her seat. But even here, even in the leather-lined cocoon of privilege, she was not at peace. She overheard crew members gossiping about certain passengers who think they're entitled, laughing softly as though they had no idea the walls could carry sound. She felt the weight of their disdain. She could have revealed herself then, pulled rank, demanded obedience. But she didn't. She had learned long ago that timing was everything. Exposing herself too soon would only satisfy pride, not purpose. And she had a greater purpose now, to remind every single person in this company who she was and who they served.
The engines roared, the plane lifted, the city fell away beneath the clouds, and as the world shrank below, Layla closed her eyes and saw not just the insult of one day, but the cracks that were forming in the empire she had built. She knew what must come. Not yet, but soon. And when it came, they would never forget the woman they told to wait outside. She let the plane carry her like a secret across the sky, and for the first hour she simply watched. People settle into their roles as if rehearsed, the businessman with his briefcase pretending to read, the teenager earphones clamped like armor, the elderly couple trading soft jokes like currency. The flight attendants moved with practiced choreography, offer, pour, smile, smiles so honed they might as well have been stamped. The same faces who had dismissed her earlier were now offering mock solicitousness to other passengers, their small performances lubricating the machine of travel. Layla listened. She had a talent for listening that had nothing to do with hearing. It was a skill of perception, cultivated in rooms where men shouted over one another to drown out inconvenient facts. She heard the cadence of a particular crew member's voice, the woman at the rear galley who had rolled her eyes at a steward, overheard a fragment from a pilot through the cockpit door, a joke about a regional manager, a name dropped like a pebble into pond water and rippling outward. Names mattered. They were fingerprints on the machinery of the company. When the meal service started, she watched how small injustices took shape. A tray delayed for a passenger with small children, a switch in seating priorities that looked arbitrary, a curt refusal to accommodate a wheelchair passenger's request for assistance until an officious supervisor intervened. Each micro-insult was a filament in the braid of neglect. She felt them like pinpricks. If she had remained aloof, she would have chalked this up to human error. But she had not built an airline on abstractions. She had built it on standards, on the slow, stubborn mathematics of service. Someone had let those standards fray. Revenge was, for Layla, not merely an appetite, but a lesson in pedagogy. She wanted them to learn, not to suffer for suffering's sake. She wanted to take their complacency and challenge it until it yielded something better, until it recognized the living mosaic of travelers it served. She closed her eyes and began to plan, not with malice, but with the cold geometry of a woman who had learned that correction required precision. She began with the crew roster. Her phone, tucked like a talisman, had access to things the gate agent could never imagine. A private message to her operations director, brief but cryptic. Watch the flight, note behavior, report. Then another to her head of customer experience. Let them see both sides. She wrote nothing more. She liked letting other minds fill in the blanks. It revealed more than directives ever could. By the time the plane touched down, murmurs of discontent were already coalescing into formal complaints. A passenger in row 20 had posted a terse video of a crew member's brusque remark. A parent had filed a complaint about a delayed assistance request. An elderly man had been served the wrong meal.
These were small things. The industry called them service incidents. But to Layla, they were symptoms. She signed off on follow-ups before she even left the aircraft. Calls from supervisors, forms filled, apologies scheduled. Yet beneath the procedural fixes, she knew something deeper was needed. An act that would enter the company's culture not as paperwork, but as memory. She made a decision then, in the airport's fluorescent wash, where people who had not yet smelled home stood in temporary exile. She would teach them with spectacle. Not cruelty, there was no appetite for that, but with consequence and education carved into a public performance so benign that it would sting. The first move was administrative and surgical. Back in her office, late into the evening when the building breathed a quieter air, she summoned files and people like a teacher calling students to the blackboard. She called the flight's purser in. She asked to see the logbooks, the service reports, the security footage. Her voice was neutral. Neutrality could be more terrifying than fury, because it implied that the math had been done. Numbers and facts do not lie. The footage showed a dozen moments, some petty, some carelessly indifferent. The purser, Olivia, a bright woman who had been promoted quickly and who carried abruptness like jewelry, watched the replays with a face like a slowly reassembling jigsaw puzzle. There were things Olivia had not seen as problems. There were things she had rationalized. Layla did not name the humiliation at the gate. She did not brand the attendant. Instead, she asked questions about training, recency of customer service refreshers, and metrics. The purser answered with candor, posture slackening with the knowledge that truth had been recognized.
"We don't have time for a 12-step moral lesson," Olivia said at one point, the edge back in her voice. "We have schedules. We have turnarounds. Soft skills don't pay the bills." Layla smiled in that way that contained continence. "Soft skills are the currency of our product," she said. "If they fail, everything else fails too." From there, she drafted a plan that was both corrective and theatrical. The most visible players on the flight roster would attend a mandatory 2-week retraining program. That part was routine. The part that would linger like a bruise, however, would be the public-facing gesture she planned for the company's next all-staff meeting. She would not humiliate anyone by name. She abhorred that cheap cruelty. She wanted something structurally humbling, a reversal of roles, where gate agents, crew, and some frontline supervisors would spend 3 days living the passenger experience in ways that could not be gamed. The board liked the idea. She framed it as Customer Immersion Week, a phrase polished like a mirror. The phrase disguised the lesson, which was deliberate. Charm softened the medicine. Executives applauded, flattered at the novelty. It had enough PR sheen to be a win. She insisted, however, on one clause that everyone thought merely ceremonial. The sessions would be observed by members of senior management, including her, incognito. The week arrived. Layla did not announce herself to the staff. She would be, for a time, one of them. She sat, unrecognized, in a strip of seats at the training facility where fluorescent light softened into afternoon. She watched a dozen faces enter the room, some arrogant, some embarrassed, most convinced they had little to learn. She kept a small pad and wrote notes not in the language of condemnation, but of inquiry. Where did empathy break down? What excuses shielded poor behavior? How many had been promoted for speed rather than patience? On the second day, a scenario was arranged. A simulated flight in which staff were assigned passenger roles and passengers were assigned staff roles in a dizzying swap. The gate agents were instructed to wheel a wheelchair, to manage a child's tantrum, to reconcile a ticketing error that a mock-up computer system would magnify into absurdity. For 3 days they stood in lines, felt the indignity of lost luggage, and navigated the kind of bureaucracy they once dispensed. Layla observed the slow change of faces, bristles thawing into new tentative softness. But theater is only useful when it returns to reality. Layla wanted to make sure the lesson translated. So she added a second, bolder move. She initiated a policy. Any passenger complaint that stole headlines, viral videos, trending hashtags, would be acknowledged publicly by the company within 24 hours, not as a legal evasion, but as a human conversation. The company would publish the steps it took to address the issue and invite the passengers involved for a face-to-face review with senior staff. It was transparency wielded like a scalpel. The first test came sooner than many expected. A clip from an altercation at a small regional airport, someone berating a passenger for asking for help, went up on social media and gathered a storm. The video painted the airline as petty and tone-deaf. Internally, the PR team panicked. Legally, consultants prepared cautious statements. Layla cut through the committee like a bright blade. Find the passenger, find the crew, bring them to the city, sit down together, air the facts. It was audacious, it was risky, but audacity, Layla knew, was the engine of change when executed with tenderness. They did locate the passenger, a middle-aged man traveling to see his estranged daughter, and the attendant who had snapped at him. They brought them into a room that smelled faintly of coffee and that had a camera on a tripod for documentation, but not for spectacle. Layla was still incognito, observed the meeting from the corner of the room. The attendant, young, harried, her eyes darting with defensive calculation, said something about rules and pressure. The passenger spoke of fear, of his daughter's frailty, of the way his voice had trembled, and how the attendant's tone had cut into him. Words are fragile things, but in that enclosed space, they became concrete. The attendant apologized in a way that felt genuine because it was not read from a script. It fumbled and tripped and was therefore human. After, Layla met with the attendant alone. She did not scold, she taught. She explained the mathematical symmetry. Every passenger was someone's child, parent, or friend. Mistakes could be remediated. Habits could be retrained. The attendant, surprised by the lack of fury, listened. People respond to expectations just as much as to penalties. She learned that afternoon that being held to a standard by someone who believed they could improve was a far stronger teacher than humiliation.
The company's public response, an invitational apology video, honest and unspun, changed the narrative faster than any legal memo could have. The passenger accepted the apology on camera. The attendant promised to undergo additional training. The story circulated, but now it bore a different hue: accountability rather than cover-up. The airline's reputation steadied. More importantly, inside the company, the story became an example of how mistakes could be opportunities. Yet Layla knew this was not the end. Structural change runs on friction and patience. She set up a new incentive: staff who performed small yet sincere acts of kindness, helping an anxious passenger to their gate, noticing an elderly traveler's need without being asked, would be publicly acknowledged in monthly communications. The board laughed at the sentimentality, but the effect was electric. Gratitude creates its own momentum. The culture adjusted like a ship correcting its course by a few degrees. Over time, the path diverged. All of this was, in the end, the education she had desired. But the gate agent who had told her to wait outside, that casual, default cruelty, still existed somewhere in the ecosystem, preserved by the network of patronage that always grows in large institutions. Layla could have fired the woman on the spot. She could have made an example. But she remembered the gate agent's life, like the attendant's, was likely made up of small indignities too. She preferred to be surgical rather than theatrical. She arranged a meeting, private and kind. The woman sat, fingers twisting a paper cup, eyes avoiding the window where planes nested like sleeping beasts. Layla introduced herself as the airline's founder, but she did not shout it. She simply said, "I heard about what happened today." The woman's defense sprang up, not denial, but a flinch. Layla listened. She learned that the agent had been operating on a spine of understaffing, of quotas and per diem pressures that made empathy a luxury. The problem was not purely moral, it was systemic. They swapped stories. The woman of the gate spoke of a sick child at home and an unpaid loan. Layla told a pared-down version of her own story, the hunger and the hinge points that shaped her. She spoke not to dominate the narrative, but to make her counterpart understand how the small cruelties that propelled some forward were themselves chains. At the meeting's end, she offered something surprising. Not a finger-wagging, but an opportunity. The agent would be enrolled in an accelerated leadership program that included training, mentorship, and a path to a supervisory role, provided she committed to it. Some called Layla's approach indulgent. She called it practical. Talent wasted in the name of punishment is a kind of waste an empire cannot afford. The agent accepted, trembling like a person who has been given a new map. For Layla, the encounter was a small victory. It taught her that remedies need to be as diverse as the failures they seek to correct. Yet there was another layer she could not ignore. Pride had been wounded that day, the kind that manifests in minor acts of subterranean sabotage. Someone had, at some point, decided that first-class passengers were to be fawned over while economy passengers could be tolerated. That division had seeped into scheduling, into resourcing. It was inefficiency masquerading as social stratification. She set about remedying that, reallocating resources so that service standards would not vary by cabin but by need. More stewards were assigned to thicker segments. More patience was budgeted into schedules. The changes did not make headlines overnight. They do not. Transformation is a long, quiet economy. But the seed had been planted, and it took root in surprising places. A gate agent in another city wrote to acknowledge the new training module had made him reevaluate how he spoke to a certain demographic of travelers. A purser sent a short, halting email about a man whose anxiety she had noticed and helped, an act that made no PR sense, but was exactly the currency Layla wanted to mint. And yet Layla was not content to stop at internal reform. She had an audience beyond the walls of her company. Competitors, regulators, a public that had been fed on tales of arrogance in the skies. She began to speak at conferences about service as empathy, not show. She pressed for regulations that encouraged training standards across the industry. Her voice, calm, rarely raised, began to be quoted in trade magazines. That was when a curious effect emerged. By correcting herself, she became a standard-bearer. Competitors began to mimic, and soon the air became a small field of experiments in better behavior. All of this was strategic, yes, but it was also personal. The humiliation at the gate had been a tiny ember of indignation. What she had kindled from it was not revenge as retribution, but revenge as correction. The notion that those who have power must wield it toward repair, not spectacle. She had no interest in ruin. She had an interest in refinement.
Still, the memory of being told to wait outside pulsed like a barometer. She would not let it fade into mere anecdote. On the anniversary of that flight, she arranged a small but pointed event, a company-wide day of service where senior management, executives, and even board members spent the day behind counters and on gates, handling complaints, pushing carts, ferrying wheelchairs. Cameras recorded, but the footage was used for training, not for mockery. When the day ended, she walked home through the quiet city, feeling the long warmth of work done well. There were detractors, of course. Critics called the moves PR. Some staff resented being watched. A board member grumbled about the costs. But Layla had made peace with criticism long ago. It is a fossil of success. She watched the months pass and measured change by small metrics that told big truths. Complaint resolution times dropped, passenger satisfaction inching upward, internal surveys reporting a modest rise in empathy scores. The company's financials remained solid. Paradoxically, service improved loyalty, and loyalty improved the bottom line. On a rainy Thursday, months after she had been told to wait outside, the gate agent who had dismissed her approached her in the same terminal. This time she sought Layla out, hands trembling, cheeks flushed. There was no pomp. The woman apologized, raw and immediate, and spoke of having been overwhelmed that day. Layla accepted, in the way that leaves room for both accountability and dignity. It was not a scene designed for cameras. It was a human one. The arc of Layla's project bent in small ways toward compassion. She had wanted to teach a lesson, but she had also wanted to preserve the people who worked for her, who, flawed and human, were her instruments. Correction and care could coexist. The proof lay in the dozen people who had taken their training seriously and now performed small mercies across the cabins and concourses. Still, under the surface of these reforms, a quieter operation homed, one that involved systems and satellites, not apologies. Layla had ordered an upgrade to the company's service algorithms so that they could better predict passenger needs. Families traveling with infants flagged, elderly travelers given extra time, passengers with mobility concerns attended to before issues could flare. Data, properly applied, became a form of kindness. It required engineers and nurses of the company, technical staff and humanists working in an uneasy, potent alliance. On a late evening, alone in her office, Layla watched the dashboard she had commissioned. Tiny green bars climbed and fell. A map flickered with the company's flights, each a node in the web. She felt a private satisfaction. The world she had made, messy, imperfect, and stubborn, was improving in increments. She remembered the gate agent's face, the slight curl of arrogance that had once closed off a room. She thought of all the small faces that looked out from aircraft windows and of the dozen acts of courtesy that would ripple outward unseen. Revenge, she had discovered, is not always the spectacle of retribution. Often it is the quiet rearrangement of systems until the injustice has neither place nor reason to exist. She had taught them a lesson with no fanfare, an education in humility and service, one that had been more expensive than a firing, but more lasting. The airline would carry its passengers differently now, and that, to her, was victory enough. And yet, as she turned off the lights and the city exhaled, she knew that the work would never be finished. Complacency grows like ivy. It must be trimmed season after season. She had changed one small brick in the wall. The rest would require constant attention. But for tonight at least, she allowed herself a small smile. The woman they had told to wait outside had not shouted or shamed. She had, with deliberate care, handed back to the people who served her the possibility of being better. Somewhere in the world, a child reached for her mother's hand as they boarded a plane. An attendant paused to help. The gesture was small. It would ripple. And when change rippled, the people who built it felt this warmth, whether they knew the architect or not. Later, soon, she would write the final chapter. There would be reckonings that required more than policy and pedagogy, people who resisted change stubbornly, contracts that needed rewriting, an industry that still preferred spectacle over substance. But those battles demanded a different temperament. For now, in the hush between flights, Layla allowed the victory to be gentle and the revenge to be a lesson that would outlast any insult. She slept that night with the hush of engines in her bones and a plan folded like a letter beside her pillow.
The rain came down in streaks against the glass walls of the skyscraper, making the city blur into streaks of light and shadow. Layla sat alone at the head of the mahogany table in the boardroom, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on the reflection of herself in the pane. Months had passed since the day she was told to wait outside, and her reforms were already reshaping the airline's soul. Yet beneath the veneer of progress, she felt the old currents tugging. The resistance of those who thrived on arrogance, the quiet sabotage of executives who had mistaken her silence for weakness. The lesson had begun, but it was not complete. The board meeting was called to order. A half-circle of men and women sat before her, each carrying the scent of old power, expensive suits, crisp ties, polished shoes. Some were allies, others opportunists, a few open opponents. They had tolerated her interventions, but tolerance was not loyalty. They had whispered that her focus on empathy and service was costly, that it risked profit margins, that her methods made the airline soft. Today she would teach them the last and most necessary lesson, that compassion and strength were not contradictions, but the same steel tempered differently. The board meeting was called to order. A half-circle of men and women sat before her, each carrying the scent of old power, expensive suits, crisp ties, polished shoes. Some were allies, others opportunists, a few open opponents. They had tolerated her interventions, but tolerance was not loyalty. They had whispered that her focus on empathy and service was costly, that it risked profit margins, that her methods made the airline soft. Today she would teach them the last and most necessary lesson, that compassion and strength were not contradictions, but the same steel tempered differently. The CFO was the first to speak, his voice smugly rehearsed. Passenger satisfaction scores are up, yes, but so are operating costs, training, new staffing allocations, this immersion experiment. Our margins are shrinking. Layla did not flinch. And loyalty? The head of marketing shuffled his papers. Retention rates are climbing. Repeat bookings up by 15%. And revenue? She pressed. The CFO grimaced. Stable. Layla leaned forward, her voice low, sharp enough to cut glass. Stable in an industry where half our competitors are hemorrhaging passengers. Stable while others lose trust. Stable when they scramble to patch their scandals, and we are being praised for ours. Her words carried weight. Silence followed. She allowed it to stretch, each second pressing against their ribs like a slow constrictor. Finally she stood, her figure illuminated by the lightning that cracked the horizon outside. You see numbers, I see futures. You see costs, I see investments. You see softness, I see survival. She paced slowly, like a general surveying her troops. They told me to wait outside. They dismissed me as invisible. And I, who built this empire from dust, was reminded of what invisibility feels like. That is what our passengers feel when we treat them as burdens instead of human beings. If you cannot understand that, then you have no place here. One of the older board members, a man with silver hair and the arrogance of lineage, scoffed. With respect, Miss Rahman, business is not charity. We don't coddle customers. We move them from point A to point B. Layla turned her gaze on him, and for the first time her composure cracked, not into anger, but into something colder. Business, she said softly, is nothing without trust. We sell more than tickets. We sell safety, dignity, belonging. Strip that away, and we're not an airline. We're a bus with wings. Is that the empire you want to inherit? The man had no reply. He looked away. Layla let the silence settle once more before delivering the coup de grace. She reached into her folder and slid a document across the table. As of today, I am invoking my controlling shareholder rights. From this moment, service standards are not optional. They are binding. Training, empathy metrics, accountability, transparency. Enshrined into policy, written into every contract, carved into the spine of this airline. Murmurs rippled. Some resisted, others nodded, a few looked relieved. The silver-haired man paled. He had underestimated her resolve. This is not a suggestion, this is law. Her voice rang like thunder, final and irrevocable. The meeting ended in uneasy silence, but beneath the tension was the weight of inevitability. The board could grumble, but they could not outvote her. The reforms were no longer temporary experiments, they were the foundation. And so the reckoning began. In the weeks that followed, the industry buzzed. Other airlines mocked her at first, calling her the compassionate capitalist, sneering that her focus on dignity would erode profits. But as scandals tore through competitors, videos of mistreated passengers, lawsuits over discrimination, strikes from disillusioned staff, her airline thrived. Passengers flocked not because of lower prices or flashier branding, but because they felt safe, seen, respected. Journalists asked her how she had done it. She answered with deliberate simplicity, by remembering that power begins with people. But within her own halls, resistance still simmered. Certain executives bristled at her authority, whispering of coups and buyouts. One in particular, the silver-haired board member, began to plot quietly, rallying shareholders who resented her reforms. She knew. She always knew. And she waited.
When the annual shareholders' assembly arrived, the grand ballroom glittered with wealth and ambition. Investors gathered, eager for dividends, for reassurances, for power plays. The silver-haired man rose, his voice dripping with confidence. Under Miss Raman's leadership, we have grown complacent. She squanders resources on training programs and PR stunts. I move that we consider restructuring leadership. Gasps rippled. Eyes turned to her. Layla rose slowly, her presence commanding silence. She carried no notes, no papers, only the calm authority of a woman who had fought battles far harsher than corporate politics. You call compassion a stunt. You call training waste. You call transparency weakness. Yet while others burn in scandal, we grow stronger. While they lose passengers, we gain loyalty. While they are investigated, we are celebrated. Do you think that happened by accident, or do you think it happened because I remembered what you forgot? That power is not in numbers, but in people. She turned, addressing the room with fire in her voice. I built this airline from nothing. I carried it when no one believed in me. I fought when doors were slammed, when banks refused loans, when men laughed me out of boardrooms. And now, because a gate agent told me to wait outside, I remembered that the work is never finished, that we are only as strong as the weakest smile at the counter, the smallest kindness on a flight, the quietest dignity given to a passenger who has nowhere else to turn. She paused, her voice breaking into steel. If you want profits without purpose, arrogance without accountability, cruelty without consequence, sell your shares. Leave. But if you stay, understand this. My vision is not negotiable. Silence fell, thick and heavy. One by one, shareholders lowered their eyes. A few clapped hesitantly, then more. The applause grew, thunderous, drowning out the silver-haired man's scowl. The vote went through, her leadership reaffirmed by overwhelming majority. It was over. That night, Layla stood once more at the terminal, not in a boardroom, not in a press conference, but at the same airport where it had all begun. She stood quietly among the travelers, dressed simply, blending in. She watched as a gate agent smiled warmly at a frazzled mother, offering help without being asked. She watched as a flight attendant crouched to speak gently to an elderly man in a wheelchair, calling him sir with respect. She watched as a supervisor held the line steady without dismissing or belittling. This was her revenge. Not fury, not punishment, but transformation. They had told her to wait outside. Now the entire airline carried her inside its heartbeat. A little girl tugged her mother's sleeve nearby, pointing to a plane waiting on the tarmac. "Mama," she whispered, "when I grow up, I want to fly one of those." Layla smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "You will," she murmured, though the child could not hear. As the engines roared and the night swallowed the sky, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had turned insult into empire,
humiliation into legacy. They had tried to make her invisible. She had answered nonsense. And from that day on, whenever the story of the airline was told, one truth remained unshakable. The woman they had told to wait outside was the one who made sure no passenger ever felt invisible again.